Funerals are moments of finality, where we face the loss of someone we thought we knew so well. But even as we stand there, enveloped in grief, we don't realize how much more is left to be discovered. My father's funeral was one of those days that started like any other, a gathering of family, the heavy air of mourning. But there was something I hadn't expected, the truth he'd hidden from all of us. I thought I knew everything about my father, but when the funeral ended, I found out just how wrong I was. What happened next would change everything. Standing at his grave, the cold air cutting through the silence, I couldn't help but feel a strange disconnect. Everyone around me was grieving, and I was too. But something didn't feel right. My father was gone, yes, but I hadn't fully processed the fact that I would never hear his voice again. As I looked at the tombstone, I realized how little I actually knew about him. There were things I had never asked, parts of his life I'd never explored. And that day, it seemed like I would never get those answers. It wasn't just the grief that hung in the air. It was the feeling that I was missing something important. Later, we gathered at the family house for the will reading. The lawyer stood there, his face serious, and began reading from the document. The will itself wasn't unusual. My father's belongings, who would inherit what? Nothing too shocking. But then the lawyer paused. He looked at me, and I could feel my heart start racing. He said something I'll never forget. There's one more thing, something not included in the main will, but very important. I froze. What was he talking about? What else was there? Had my father left something hidden? Why hadn't anyone mentioned it before? A separate will, a secret inheritance. I couldn't make sense of it. And then the lawyer revealed it. The lawyer pulled out another document. This wasn't like the will. This was a trust, a special trust my father had set up years ago, and it named me as the beneficiary. My mind raced as I tried to understand. He had hidden part of his wealth. He'd invested in a property, a large piece of land far away from where we lived, a place I'd never even heard of. The lawyer explained the value of the land. It wasn't just an ordinary property. It was a piece of land that my father had carefully developed over the years. He had kept it all to himself, never telling anyone, not even me. How could he have kept something like this a secret? Why hadn't he mentioned it? I was left holding the papers, the map, trying to make sense of a legacy I knew nothing about. The more I looked through the documents, the more I realized how little I knew about my father's life. He had bought this land years ago, even before I was born. It was a beautiful, secluded property, near mountains and a lake. I never would have guessed this was part of his life. And yet, it had been there all along, waiting for me to find it. There were old photos, plans for the property that my father had sketched out himself. The more I uncovered, the more I realized that this wasn't just an investment. It was something deeply personal. He had envisioned building something on this land, a legacy of his own, something for the family to cherish. He had never spoken about it. He had kept it hidden, as if it were his secret to keep. And now, here I was, inheriting it. The land was mine, but it felt like I was inheriting more than just property. I was inheriting his dreams, his plans, and the part of him I had never known. I started to think about my father in a new way. The man I thought I knew wasn't just the person I grew up with. He had his own dreams, his own desires, things he kept to himself. And now, in the silence of his absence, I was left to figure out what to do with this inheritance. This wasn't just about money or property. It was about understanding the man he had been, the parts of him that remained hidden, the pieces of his life he had kept to himself. I realized that sometimes people hide things not out of malice, but because they want to protect something. Maybe it was his way of protecting me from a burden, or maybe it was his way of keeping something just for himself. The funeral should have been a moment of closure, a final goodbye, but instead it became a turning point. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one that I wasn't prepared for. The grief, the mourning, it all became secondary to the discovery of what my father had left behind. And now I am left with a choice. What will I do with this inheritance, this land, this legacy, I can't just let it sit there, forgotten. It's part of who my father was, and maybe it's part of who I need to become. In the end, I learned something important that day. Grief isn't just about loss. It's about the things we discover when we least expect them.